Hello, everyone. Oh my goodness. It's so lovely to see you all here. Welcome to Kwamina's talk. So a quick intro. Kwamina is currently a director of engineering at GiveDirectly, which aims to alleviate global poverty with direct cash transfers. He's going to talk a bit more about that in his talk. Before being at GiveDirectly, Kwamina was also a software engineer at Google, so can also kind of talk about the pros and cons and the transition and all of that. So it is so exciting to have him here today. We cannot wait. Let's start with a huge round of applause as if he's already given the best talk of his entire life. It's gonna be great.
Thank you so much, Ellie. Yep, like Ellie said, my name is Kwamina. I'm actually engineering lead at GiveDirectly. Yeah, I'm gonna be talking a little bit about what GiveDirectly does. We'll actually talk about those three things in the reverse order. So I'll talk about GiveDirectly, then I'll talk about a little bit of our tech and engineering culture, and then I'll talk about myself and my journey and how I ended up here. So I'll jump into the GiveDirectly part. And if at any point you can't hear me, just holler, let me know. I might be too close to the mic. Okay, sounds like it's good so far. So GiveDirectly, oops, it's not working. There we go. GiveDirectly is an international nonprofit that provides unconditional cash transfers to people living in extreme poverty. So a couple of interesting parts about this. We're a nonprofit, so the money that we take, we're trying to give away. We give unconditional cash transfers. So what that means is that most programs have conditionality around the aid. So a classic example is food stamps. You get food stamps to spend on food. Cash can only be spent on a certain thing. Our cash transfers are unconditional, so you can spend them on whatever you want. And as much as possible, we try to have no conditions on who's eligible for them. So we say anybody in a given geolocation will get the money. And we do our targeting based on poverty, but we don't try to say it's only going to be women or only going to be men, only going to be people who are above a certain age. And the last thing is in extreme poverty. So we really are trying to find the people who really are facing extreme poverty. A lot of this ends up being in East Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa. We have programs in a bunch of different places. So here's a couple of stats. Like I said, we have programs all over the world. A lot of it is in Africa. So you can see the countries we operate in Africa in the bottom right over there. But we also operate in America. We started operating in the US in 2020. This was new. Obviously, like I said, there's more extreme poverty in other parts of the world. But during COVID, it was very clear that there was a very large need for people there's a huge economic need. And there were lots of people who were really willing to give and really excited about finding ways to reach people closer to their community. So we started operating in the US as well. And so that list of countries is actually a little bit out of date. I think we operate in 2 more right now, but this is just kind of some high level stats. The money is also a bit out of date. We're above 630 million, but that's just a ballpark estimate. And over 1 million recipients reached. This happened this past year, and this was kind of a huge milestone. We wouldn't ever have imagined that. Yeah, we're over 500 employees. And this last bit on the bottom left is about RCTs. And I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with this, but that's kind of the gold standard for economic trials on the effectiveness of some of these interventions. And GiveDirectly is pretty unique in that we run a lot of RCTs ourselves, and we're very involved in the research community. Especially when we started out, cash was viewed with a lot of skepticism. The idea of just giving poor people money just seemed kind of insane. And so because of that, there's a whole lot of analysis done and research done on cash, and we kind of led a lot of that. At this point, cash is very well researched, but this is one of the things that we try to do. As well as giving money, we try to analyze what's the effect of the money we're giving. And yes, like I said, we've grown a lot. We started out pretty small, and now we have a fair amount of international recognition. One of the things we really do try to do is change the industry as well. Like I said, cash was not really a thing that people did about 10 or 15 years ago. And now it's starting to become the benchmark. So when somebody is going to do a new intervention to deal with infant mortality, now they'll benchmark against what if we just give the mothers money instead, and we can kind of see how much more effective is a medicine or a training program versus just giving people cash. So why cash? Why do I keep talking about money so much? There are a couple of reasons. One of the biggest reasons is recipient agency. So the idea of giving somebody money feels very impersonal, but what you're really doing is giving the recipient the choice of what they want to spend the money on. And most interventions won't give you this. This means that if the recipient really needs medicine, they get medicine. If they really need education, they get education. This is really valuable for a couple of reasons. One is because from a recipient dignity perspective, we all spend our money on whatever we think is the most important thing. But we kind of have this idea that if we're providing aid to somebody, it should be on the thing that we think is what they need. They need medicine, we'll help them with medicine. They need water, we'll help them with water. The idea that if we give somebody money and they spend it on alcohol is an anathema, that seems awful. That seems like a waste of money. But we do that all the time, maybe not all the time, but regularly. So there's some aspect of dignity that letting the recipients find what they need the money for and what they want to spend the money on. The other side is an efficiency argument. Letting people choose how they want to allocate their money tends to be much more efficient than somebody else trying to figure out what they need to spend the money on. There are lots of situations where we will think, okay, this is an area that's been affected by drought. The first thing we need to do is build a water pan. That's probably going to be the thing that's going to drive or improve the recipients' lives. And then they'll say, actually, no, what we need to do is build better seeds that are more resistant to water. We need to build better roofs so we can catch rainwater off the roofs, all sorts of things that you can't really see from the outside view, but if you're actually living in that area, you know the things that will help. The other thing, last thing, which isn't actually here, is that cash has a multiplicative effect. So the alternative to cash is in-kind aid. So let's say people need clothes. We say, let's ship them a bunch of clothes. The first thing that happens if you ship, let's say, 1,000 shirts to a village is that the seamstress is immediately going to go out of business because the shirts are all there. If you give people money, they're going to go and spend that money at the seamstress, at the tailor, and then the tailor will then spend that money on roofing or on cows or whatever. And that will have this multiplicative effect of the money stays within the community and leads to more economic activity as it propagates. The second part is the efficiency of delivery. Taking 1,000 shirts from New York City to, let's say, Rwanda, just takes a lot of resources. You have to package it, you have to ship it. There's the cost of getting it across an ocean. Cash doesn't have these problems. And most of the money we transfer is using mobile money, which often seems quite unintuitive, the idea that the world's poorest people are going to be using mobile banking. But a lot of the countries we operate in have systems where you can do mobile banking that isn't an iPhone kind of app, but you can use UUID menus and you can cash out at local spots. So even if you yourself are not literate or you don't have a phone or you don't have a mobile spot right next to you, there's almost always somewhere within, let's say, half an hour car ride, motorbike ride, where somebody from your village will be able to go and pick up the money and bring it back. And so we found that large parts of the world, much, much, much larger than we would have expected, are connected through mobile banking. And that's the primary way that we deliver cash. What that leads to is really, really incredible efficiency. This is what I think first put us on the map, is that right now we're around 88% efficiency. That's for every dollar that we get, we give 88 cents to a recipient. And this is much, much higher than most nonprofits operate at. There's so many kind of operating costs, paying my salary, all this, everything, all the buildings. But cash, aside from the cost of getting the cash there, is basically free. Whereas you don't have only the shipping costs of most in-kind aid. And then this is not unique to cash, but as we scale, you just get very, very good economies of scale. You start building relationship with the telecommunications companies. So the mobile money companies are more willing to kind of extend their networks. The whole thing has kind of a runaway effect. The last thing I mentioned a little bit before is that there's a lot of evidence around cash. Because it's met with so much skepticism, there've been loads and loads and loads and loads of studies. Some of them we do ourselves, some of them are from the wider research community. And there are all sorts of things that you measure cash against. And on most metrics, cash performs very well. So you can see economic, education, health, and then things you wouldn't expect as much, child labor, physical or sexual abuse. We see recipients report that when you're in privation and hardship, everything gets harder, everything gets worse. And so things that you wouldn't have expected, like marital disputes, just get worse, get amplified by the lack of support. And so cash ends up addressing some of these concerns that you wouldn't really expect. And then, like I said, because cash is spent on things you need, the things that people need ends up being very, very individualized. And so it ends up meeting their needs for things that you would never have thought that that's their problem. This is something that cash has helped. The last thing is the question we almost always get is on something like sin goods, tobacco, alcohol, drugs. People always are concerned or curious, I should say, how much of money is being spent on things like alcohol and tobacco. And you actually find that it tends to reduce spending. It's more or less no effect, but if there's any effect, it tends to be a slight reduction. And this is similar to what I'm saying, that when you're in privation, you end up needing or looking to other things to try and make your life in any way better, that when you're able to fend for yourself better, you end up having less of that. So how do we do it? I mentioned a bit about mobile money, but I'll talk a bit about the steps of how we deliver cash. The first thing is program design. So we have a couple of different types of programs. We do a standard rolling program where we try to enroll recipients. We give them 2 lump sum donations. It totals to about $1,000. It depends on the country. And we've done a bunch of different testing on the different models, payment models, and 2 lump sum donations ends up being quite effective. One of the reasons for this is that large lump sum donations or lump sum transfers allow you to invest. So if you get, let's say, 10 payments over a year, you never really have enough money to say, I'm going to go until the end. I'm going to go and buy a house. I'm going to go and buy a motorbike. I'm going to buy a business, and you can launch something new. Getting a big lump sum payment allows you to do that. Because there are 2, though, you still have an aspect of saving and planning, which is also really effective because you're able to say, if you buy a cow and then there's a drought, you're basically where you started out. Having 2 lump sum payments shifted out a little bit means that you have a little bit of shock absorption to that. Another example, which is the polar opposite of that, is a UBI program. So we're launching UBI programs. We have a 12-year research study that we started in Kenya about 3 years ago. And we also do non-study programs, just we're giving UBI as the form of the intervention. And like I said, that's the exact opposite. You don't have savings, but you have that kind of security. You're able to start thinking in terms of what will I do a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, if you know you have a guaranteed basic income for the next 5 years or whatever the program length happens to be. And we see that this is something recipients really, really value. It really lets them change their mindset and do things they would never have had the opportunity to do otherwise. So that's program design. The next step is enrollment. Traditionally, we would always go in person, and we have staff in all the countries we operate, and they'd go and they'd do something called sensitization. So if you say, we're going to give everybody buckets of money, the first thought is that's corruption. This is a scam. And most of the time it is. And so we do a lot of work in the community to say, this is how we're going to give the money. This is when it's going to come. It's going to be 2 payments. It's not going to be 3. It's not going to be this, to really make sure people trust us, as well as recipient safeguarding. Because when you're delivering money, it opens up a lot of opportunities for corruption, for exploitation. And so we want to make sure that we do the groundwork to make sure the recipients are going to have a positive experience when we deliver cash. On that same trail, we do audit. So we have a separate audit team that's almost entirely separate from our field operations. The people who are in the audit team, their identities aren't known by the field teams, because we want to make sure that our teams are being followed up in the most, as well as they possibly can be. Because the worst thing that you can do as a nonprofit is be coming in and causing your own problems. And every nonprofit has this. There are always, sexual abuse problems. There are always exploitation. And we want to make sure that our team that is checking on that has no connection with the team that's actually doing it. So there's no opportunity for collusion there. Then we do the transfers. So this is like what I was talking about, using mobile money. And then afterwards, we do monitoring. So one aspect of the monitoring is recipient safeguarding, making sure that they did have a positive experience. Nobody asked them to try to take their money. Nobody asked them to give their PIN, because the future transfer is going to go through that PIN. The other aspect is the surveying and the research. So after we give money, even though it's completely unconditional, we often ask, what did you spend your money on? And we spend a lot of time saying, we're asking this question for research. It does not affect future transfers, doesn't affect anything. But especially the international community wants to know where the money is going and what's happening with it. And so we try to ask these follow-up questions. And then I can't see it because of my thing, but we evaluate our programs as well. We try to figure out what went well, what went badly, and try to make sure our efficiency and recipient experience is as high as possible. Whoops, 1 through 2. Now I'm going to talk about our tech side, our engineering side. I'm an engineer, so I'll talk mostly about that. We have a lot of other tech pillars. We have data, we have design, we have a lot of other things going on. I'm going to focus mostly on engineering here. There are 3 main engineering teams within GiveDirectly. The first is the field technology team. And this is all focused on transferring money and getting money to recipients. So there are a couple of projects we've been working on recently. One's called AutoPay. In the past, we've had a lot of manual steps in the payment process, because whenever you're transferring money, it's really important that you don't transfer to the wrong person, nothing goes wrong. And there are lots of legislative requirements to say you have to have somebody at a certain level actually signing the check, doing whatever. But as we are moving to become more technological, both as a company and just just in general, we're finding ways to automate a lot of this and drive up the scale. And so one of the things that the field tech team is working on is how can we make this transfer process as automated as possible. On that same vein, auto enrollment is for figuring out which recipients are eligible for our programs. Like I said, we try to be unconditional, but there often are some degree of eligibility requirements. For example, some countries will say you have to be over 18 to receive a cash transfer. We'd never give somebody, well, for the same program, we will never give somebody the money twice. So we have to make sure this person is actually, it's the first time they're getting the money. We also have a lot around making sure if we're doing a village at a time, we have to make sure this person really belongs to that village. And often, obviously, people move around, and so figuring out, is this person really a resident is a bit difficult. And so we're building out tools to make that more automated as well. The last thing was we're building out a next-gen survey platform to find better ways of measuring recipient well-being and to do some of our research. The next team is the innovation team. It definitely has the best name. I would say all the teams innovate, but historically it's been working for finding new ways and situations for deploying cash. So one of these things is humanitarian projects. I talked about our COVID-19 relief in the US. When there's a massive disaster, one of the things that is helpful is a quick injection of cash, because when you've lost your house, you just need something to, well, not you just need, but one of the things you need is something to tide you over the next weeks or months before you can get back on your feet. And so we're working on ways to be better about humanitarian cash transfers. I mentioned auto enrollment on the previous step. There's something innovation team spends a lot of time on. We've been working with Berkeley on finding models of targeting to figure out who is affected by a disaster and where are the world's poorest people. Obviously, we don't always have up-to-date census records, but you can do a whole lot with geospatial data and satellite targeting to figure out this is an area that has been drought affected. This is an area that we should look into. And then during COVID, we were actually unable to go in person for the first time in our history. And that was quite problematic because so much what we're doing around recipient safeguarding requires in-person touch points, and figuring out ways of delivering cash safely without that was a huge challenge. And the innovation team was quite involved in figuring out remote models for our programs. The last thing is crypto delivery. There's a lot of new players in East Africa specifically around giving crypto. Actually, not just East Africa, there are other parts of the world where there's less confidence in some of the government currencies and the governments themselves. And so being able to deliver crypto is seen as a way of getting around some of those concerns. This is something that we're not really doing on a large scale yet, but something that we're looking into. Lastly, the growth team, this team that I'm on. And we're doing the work to try and find ways of representing GiveDirectly to external donors and to catalyze more giving, more cash transfers. So one part of that is industry change. How do we promote cash? How do we show that cash is effective? Another part is how do we show donors where their money's going? So much of charitable giving is driven by trust. And there's so many horror stories of a charity that takes all this money and turns out it's just going to somebody's mansion, somebody's yacht. And so finding ways to really build trust with donors and really show donors where their money is going is really important. An example of this is the UBI carousel. So right now that's replaced our traditional or our old homepage. So when you go to GiveDirectly.org, you actually see an array of recipients in villages that we've already pre-enrolled. And we'll say, we're trying to raise money for this village. And we can say, this money is actually going to go to Zainab. And every recipient we have a touch point with them to make sure we know, like I said, for recipient well-being. And we take some of that information with their consent and we say, this is what I'm planning on spending the money on. These are the biggest challenges I'm facing. This is the happiest part of my day. These kind of survey questions are actually really impactful for donors because they can see this is a real person and this is where my money is going. And it kind of builds a connection between donors and recipient that's often missing in this kind of aid. We're also doing impact reports. So especially for our large donors, they would like to know what happened to my money. And we're able to say, or we're building out capacity to say, if you gave $4 million, $1 million went to Rwanda and it went to these 14 villages. 2 million went to Mozambique and it went to these 3 programs. And that really catalyzes further donations to be able to see that the money has gone out and where the money has gone out. The last thing we're working on is fundraisers and community-based giving. We'd love to be able to say, oh, I'm having a wedding. I'd like to set up a fundraiser and we're gonna all kind of come together and donate whatever it's gonna be, 30K to GiveDirectly, the kind of GoFundMe model. And so we're building out better ways of making giving not just an individual act, because there's a stigma about talking about giving. Saying I gave $1,000 feels very bloviating, but would like to find ways of breaking that down because so much of what we do is social and that catalyzes so much of our activity going forward that we'd like to find ways of doing that better. Last thing we'll talk about me, because everyone likes talking about themselves. I'll talk a little bit about my background and then talk about my path to get to GiveDirectly. So I graduated with a CS degree from Virginia Tech. I bounced around majors a little bit and then discovered computer science and found I really loved doing that, which honestly really lucky because especially now we're much more, as an industry, we're hiring a lot of people who don't have traditional degrees, but coming in with a traditional degree is just a step up. Maybe it doesn't need to be, but currently it has been. And at Virginia Tech in university, I actually worked on a couple of anti-human trafficking projects. I worked on a project that was trying to portray the trafficking impact of your purchases. So it would sync in with your Amazon purchases and it would say, Godiva has a C- score. Have you tried buying from Divine or something like that? Just kind of allowing consumers to make some of those choices. And then also in college, I interned on Google's social impact team. After university, I joined Google. Originally I was supposed to be working on the social impact team at Google. Between when I got my offer and when I actually started, the social impact team got reorganized and it was no longer available in London, which is where I started working. So I ended up working on completely different projects. So the Google search app, and then I moved to New York and worked on Google Docs. And then I moved to GiveDirectly. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of some of the things that helped for that. I think it's a transition that is quite hard for a lot of people to do, and there are a couple of reasons for that. But I'm going to talk about some of the things that I found to be quite helpful for me. One thing is that you really have to be intentional and proactive about it. The default path or the default success track in tech is to go to a big tech company and make bucket loads of money and then retire as early as you can and buy a yacht. Your yacht's optional, but you have to kind of push yourself outside of that traditional success story because there's so many organizations that have a lot of career progression, they have a lot of impact, but they're not going to be the ones that you'll hear about. A reason for this is because big tech companies have many more resources to spend on outreach. And so they're going to be companies that you just won't know about, but will be doing really awesome things. The last thing is that on the proactive front is that working at a smaller organization tends to both reward and require different, more holistic skills. So if you're working at a large tech company, you maybe never really have to do hiring. You have to do technical interviews, but you don't have to worry about reading resumes. You don't have to worry about, assessing people for fit. At a smaller org, you'll be more required to do that, which is sometimes annoying, but it also means that you're building out different skills. And a lot of people have skills that are beyond just, I'm really great at writing a very fast algorithm. And so if you are able to find a company that is smaller, you're usually able to leverage their skills as well. The second thing is avoiding lifestyle inflation. I think that we're somewhat lucky within the tech industry in that there's less of a culture around lifestyle inflation. If you go into something like law or finance, you have to go to certain dinners, you have to go to certain events. A lot of getting ahead is actually spending money. Tech has a little bit less of that culture. I wouldn't say it doesn't have that culture, but less so. And that's a really big opportunity, which means that when you are if you are in big tech, you don't necessarily need to be spending all your money on Michelin star restaurants. And that's it's nice to go, but that's actually a bit of a blessing because I know lots of people in similar industry or different industries who kind of feel trapped in that because once you start doing that on your day-to-day basis, you have no way out. And now you need a 6-figure or heaven forbid a 7-figure salary just to maintain your lifestyle. The caveat here is that everyone's situation is different. There are lots of reasons why you might need that money. And especially for women and minorities, there are lots of reasons why you might need to be taking that money and giving it, caring for somebody else, sending it somewhere else. So this is not at all me trying to say that no one needs that money or that everyone's financial situation is very different. And the last thing is that you need to position yourself in the spaces you want to be. An example is this, you guys are all here and you're going to build connections. My job at GiveDirectly, I actually had a really good friend who moved to GiveDirectly about 3 months before me. She was a product manager. And this is before they'd hired any engineers. And we both had always been, like I said, motivated towards doing something a bit more mission driven. She was at Google before as well. But just being in spaces where people are caring about similar things that you care about mean that when opportunities like this come up, you will be aware of them and you'll be involved in them. And as much as you can, start something where you are. It doesn't have to be incredible. It doesn't have to be the next $1 million company, but just starting something and making a small impact will make you aware of further problems, aware of further opportunities, and will get you on the radar of anybody else who thinks, oh, wait a second, this person did this. Maybe they could help me out with my next project. So that's just a couple of pieces of advice that I found were helpful for me. And then the rest is just Q&A. You can ask me anything about me, about GiveDirectly, about Google. Go for it.
Yeah, just feel free to raise your hands and I'll be coming around.
Hello, my name is Ala, and thank you for the interesting talk about GiveDirectly. So my question is that you said GiveDirectly interact directly with the recipient. So how do you go about areas or countries that your teams do not have access to these areas? And do you have like a mediator, and how do you make sure that the recipient got the funds?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the things that we try to do is we hire locally. So an example would be Kenya. There's something like 45 languages spoken in Kenya. And if we said we're going to go and meet all these recipients ourselves, we can't even speak the language. But our field officers are usually from the areas that we're operating in. And so we do a lot of training, we build up that capacity, but then they often will know the places that one can go, the places, how to speak to people. So it's not us coming in from, white savior complex and saying, oh, we're just gonna go find the poor people. It's actually building a capacity in the country. So we have, I think we have a country office in all the countries we operate in. Some of them are smaller than others. And so most of the staff is based out of that office. I said we're about 500 plus people. I think we're above 600 now. And about 80% is in the country offices. And then there's about, I think, 60 or 70 people who are in the global team. So we're fully remote. So in the past, it used to be in New York, but now people are kind of all over the world. It's a good question.
Hi, yeah, thank you for sharing. I was wondering what were the reasons that led you to look for different types of work after big tech, and were there other spaces that you were considering?
Yeah, so like I said, I had planned to be doing something more mission driven even when I went to Google. And so I always had kind of felt like I should be getting back to that. I actually tried to leave about a year earlier. So I left in 2021 and I tried to leave in 2020. I was right on the verge of quitting my job and my mom convinced me not to. And then about a month later, the entire world imploded. So that was kind of a good decision. And it was obviously quite hard to find work there at work during that period. Other spaces I was interested in, like I said, I had a bit of an anti-trafficking background. So I was quite interested in that. I looked at a company called Thorn that was doing sex trafficking or what's the word? Child pornography, thank you. Identifying it on the internet and finding ways of blocking that. But GiveDirectly I had known about before and I'd been really excited about, and they weren't hiring engineers at that time. And so when I discovered that they were, that was my number one choice. So.
Hello, thank you for your talk. So my question is how do you decide in which areas you'd like to expand further on? And how do you kind of approach the initial kind of targeting the audience and identifying what are the needs for the people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are a couple of different levels that we do this on. So the broad thing we're looking at is where are the people who are in most extreme poverty and working our way upward. There's a lot of difficulties about operating in a certain country because you have to have government relationships. You have to make sure you're obeying the local laws. And so maybe we could say that there's a village in Suriname that we really want to operate in, but doesn't make sense for us to start a whole office in Suriname, do all of that, perhaps not. And so we're doing a lot of work around figuring out which countries we should be operating in. And then once we get to that country, we will work on the regions that have the most extreme poverty. There's also an aspect of what are the areas that we can reach. So an example is we do a lot of work in Kenya. Kenya was the first country we operated in. But there are parts in the north of Kenya that are much harder to access. There are certain tribes that are nomadic. So what we usually do is we go to a village, we'll mark the houses, we'll say, okay, we know where these people are. We do things by domicile. it's much harder if you have a tribe that's nomadic. There are also terrorism concerns in parts of the north of Kenya. And so we take that into account as well. So it's a combination of how well can we access these places, what are the structural costs to starting a new area, and then the golden indicator is extreme poverty, how much poverty and how many people can we reach.
Hi, so I guess like you talked briefly on like lifestyle inflation and how that's pretty easy in tech or easier in tech. I guess like how do you see yourself like inspiring others in big tech spaces to care about social good or honestly use their money for anything aside from just omakase every other day?
Yeah, I think one thing is voting with your feet. So actually taking the jump and saying, I'm going to go somewhere else, I think has been really, really helpful. I think the more people see that, people doing that, the more they see that as a really viable option. I think another thing, and not to go into like a virtue ethics spiel here, but I think that the spaces that you're operating in, I think it's very easy to become very insular, and you can only hang out with, your elite rich tech friends and getting omakase every other day. But I think the more that you are operating in different environments, you'll be more grounded and be more aware of the way that the other 99.99% of the world lives. And the more you have that, it becomes more obvious that you don't necessarily need the omakase. You can just eat, I don't know, a $40 meal.
Yeah, my name is Victor. That was a great talk. So I think my question goes to, so how does GiveDirectly help to source for funds while retaining the dignity of the recipients? For instance, like a lot of nonprofit, like when they are doing like ads, for instance, they show the picture of like a starving child from like one part of Africa, and then like say, oh, they help, your $1 can save this child. So yeah. How does GiveDirectly help to like to source for these funds while still retaining dignity of those recipients?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something that we struggle with a lot. We struggle with it because to some degree they are at odds with each other. If you know that, you can reach a certain donor, what a donor really cares about is seeing a starving child. You have a lot of incentive to go and put a starving child in front of them if you know that's actually going to go and help someone. And so you're saying, if this helps a recipient, is it worth that? We think that's a slippery slope because you can kind of justify anything by that argument. We have a whole recipient advocacy team. And so all of our surveys, all of our comms, they all go through that to say, how do recipients want to be represented? And so we have guidelines on, you don't say you're saving people, you don't say you're doing these, have ways of representing what we're doing and ways of representing recipients themselves. We do a lot of consent around, we do a lot of consent work because the idea of, if somebody's illiterate, the idea of, oh, we're going to put this in these spaces and not in those spaces is often a difficult thing to communicate. So do a lot of work trying to make sure the recipients are very aware of where their images, where their data is being used. And then the last thing is we just don't duplicate kind of images. We would never say, just as a baseline, we would never say, you're all giving to this person. We'll say, this is an example of a recipient. Or we'll say, for our UBI program, we spend a ton of effort to make sure nobody ever gets double mapped to the same person, because then you start getting into this person looks photogenic. Let's just put them in front of everyone and tell everyone that their money went to, this starving child or this, this image.
Hello, my name is Ronnie, and my question is, how did you guys come about into doing a project with UBI? What was the inspiration, I guess?
Yeah. I think UBI as a concept has gained a lot of momentum in the past 5-10 years, domestically in the US. Cost-wise, it's much harder to do in a place like America than in other parts of the world. And there was some research that showed it was very effective. And we realized that we had an opportunity to try out a different format of programs. So like I said, we tested a bunch of different transfer allocations. And one of the ones we hadn't tested out was UBI, was a 5-year-long, every month you're getting a certain amount of money. And so we realized that was an opportunity to discover, is there a way that we can be more effective in how we're giving money? and also to contribute to the research around UBI, both domestically and internationally. One of the other things I said was that we really are trying to change some of the paradigms around how people look at aid and find places where cash can be effective. And if you're able to see, this is actually what it looks like to do a UBI program at scale, we'll learn a lot about that. Maybe it isn't effective, maybe it is, but we'll know this is something that we can do. We can scale this up to other countries, both us as GiveDirectly, but if you are a government, you can say, we've learned from what GiveDirectly did in this area, and we can build our own cash transfer UBI program somewhere else.
Hey, Kwamina, thank you so much for speaking with us. It seems to me like much of GiveDirectly's work is location-based. Like earlier you mentioned, like, oh, we have to make sure this person is a resident of this town, village, et cetera. So my question is, you have an intersection with human trafficking that you've chatted about. I wonder if you see any intersections with GiveDirectly to work on that issue, or wider like human migration movement from place to place as well. Do you see that in your future?
Yeah, so we do some projects that are specifically around refugees. I don't know if this is entirely answering your question, but we do projects that are targeting refugee camps. We're giving money to refugees. So that's one way that we are interacting with the migration question. We also do some cash plus programs. We've done a lot of research around that, about if they're more effective than straight cash. And when I say cash plus, I mean, you give cash and you give programming around whatever it is, contraception, or around trafficking, or around better, agriculture practices. The evidence kind of is mixed on that, and I think we're still going through figuring out how that's effective. That's one of the ways that we're able to affect issues beyond just providing the aid itself.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So I'm just curious to know like how you determine who's eligible, and if you use any technologies or algorithms to determine who's eligible.
Yeah, that's very different for different programs. So in our standard programs, we try to say anybody is eligible. Some of our programs, if we're doing a program with, let's say, USAID, they might have a policy that says they might want to be reaching, let's say, women in a certain area. And so they'll say, we have $3 million that we want to give to women in Mozambique. And we'll say, well, we'd love to give it to everybody, but giving $3 million to women is great. So we will operate a program that will have that as one of the selection criteria. Like I said, a lot of our touch points are in person. So we do a lot of that eligibility determinations by actually having our field staff go and they see who is here, what are they this age, are they whatever. One of the things we did start doing more recently, and especially during COVID, is doing this remote. So for our broader programs where we say anybody within this area, we can say, if you're willing to share your cell phone records, we know that you have a contract with this company. We know that the same way they do, they can figure out your identity by having you text in. If the recipients consent to that, we can do some level of, especially geolocation-based eligibility, just from cell phone records and just from other things that they can submit remote.
Hi, for the folks who receive the two-time payment, do you do any kind of evaluation for whether you would need to continue providing them funds so that you can help them progress in the right direction?
Yes and no. So not on the individual level. One of the things that is hard about what we do is that we have limited funds, and saying that we're going to take the money that we've earmarked for somebody else and give it to somebody because we think that they are more deserving would go against kind of the fairness that we build into our programs. And so we will not say to anybody, you will get more money from a particular program. You could be at the intersection of multiple programs. So for example, if the USAID had a program where they want to give money to women in an area, and then separately, we have a program that we're going to do a UBI program for everybody within an area, you could get money both ways. But on the macro level, we do that. So we do a lot of research of saying, if we give people this much money, how long does the benefit last for? Does it last for 10 years, last for 20 years, does it last for a lifetime? If we give people half that money, is it effective? And there are lots of studies kind of tracking the impacts at various amounts of money and distribution strategies.
We'll probably have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Ruth, and thank you so much for that. I just had a question about systems. How do you provide money for people in a system that doesn't work? For example, you're giving money to people in a particular community, but then the government is putting policies that are against the people, and there are so many things. So they're receiving the money, but like it's like the government is taking it away through different means. How do you make sure that the people are actually using the money, and it's not that even with the money, the systems that are already in place are still fighting against them?
Yeah, that's a really hard one. I think the short answer is that we don't have a great way of doing that. And some of that is intentional because we as a Western NGO don't want to be in the position of us saying, we think your government's bad, so we're going to work against your government, because we might be right, but we might be wrong. And to some degree, that's not our place to do that. We do want to make sure that we're not propping up regimes that we think are illegitimate, propping up regimes that are committing human rights atrocities. And so a lot of that is which countries are we going to operate in. But we don't do any direct work for or against governments. We try to be completely orthogonal to the question of governmental policies. We're not always able to do that 100%, but that's our official stance. And we feel like that's the healthiest perspective to take.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Kwamina. Let's do one big round of applause.